I'm Councillor Josie Channer. I'm a councillor in Barking and Dagenham, and we'll be talking about diversity in local government, and with some amazing guests tonight. There's so much that needs to be done, and we really cannot stop pushing for greater representation in local government, and the statistics are quite depressing. Following the 2019 local government elections, it showed that only 35% of women, of councillors were women in England and Wales. That, I'm sure many people would agree here this evening, that is completely unacceptable. Although Labour councillors, 45% of Labour councillors were women, we still need to push for 50-50 representation. In terms of other diversity, 96% of councillors in England and Wales are white. That's not reflective of the population. So there's a lot of work to do. And even though those statistics make, you know, most women want to cry, we're here this evening to listen to and learn from women that are actually smashing the glass ceiling in local government. And I'm very excited to introduce some of our 4 panelists tonight. So first, without further ado, I'll start with Councillor Erica Lewis. She is the leader of Lancaster City Council and founder of the Women's Speak Network, which is now called the Equality Rights Alliance in Australia. Erica has a PhD in women's leadership and a master's in public administration from Harvard University. We've also got with us Councillor Salma Arif, a councillor from Leeds. She's the Deputy Executive Member for Children and Families, co-chair of the Nasna Nazim organisation that brings together Jewish and Muslim women. Thirdly, we've got Councillor Favour Ezidifi, and she is the Deputy Leader for Watford Labour Group. She's a social worker and NHS team leader. Finally, but not least, we've got Councillor Ellie Southwood, a councillor from Brent and lead member for Housing and Welfare. She's also the chair of the Royal National Institute for Blind People. So we've got some fantastic panelists tonight, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've got to say and their experiences. So I'll hand it over firstly to Erica to start.
As you've heard, my name is Councillor Dr. Erica Lewis. And there is, of course, as there always is, a bit of a story behind that. I went to 6 primary schools across 3 education systems, first in the UK, then in Australia. Every time we changed schools, I watched my mum, who left school at 16 herself, push and push to make sure we were being placed in the right classes and fight to get my brother, who had as yet not had his Asperger's diagnosed, get the support he needed. I learnt from my mum that you could and probably should challenge the system. Uni was where I hit the patriarchy with a hard bump. I was harassed by a group of men who didn't like my politics, and I ended up dropping out of university, too scared to go to campus. I got a job. I got involved in the women's movement and the Labor Party. I got a law degree, a master's degree from public admin from Harvard, and eventually my PhD. As you've heard, I've built national women's organisations, served on the board of social enterprises, and I currently sit as a member of the board of the World YWCA, which is one of the world's largest and oldest women's organisations. I'm also the leader of Lancaster City Council, a county councillor for Lancaster South East, and a lecturer in leadership and social entrepreneurship at the University of Cumbria. But for a panel like this, I also think it's important to tell you, I wasn't elected president of my student union. I wasn't elected to Parliament the first time I ran. I wasn't selected for the 2019 general. I was selected for the last set of Euros. Of course, I wasn't elected. And I was repeatedly not selected for the Fabian Women's Network mentoring program, which I guess is just to say that we are often introduced by the things we have succeeded by, but actually the things we didn't succeed at are really important. And as we talk about trying to change who is represented on our councils and encourage women in all of our diversity to stand and run, it's important to remember that actually lots of us take several goes before we get there, and that sometimes, you know, it really is important to remember that democracy does not elect the best qualified candidate. Democracy elects the person with the most votes. So winning or losing isn't a reflection on you or your quality as a candidate. It's a reflection on what happened at the polling booth that day. And so if you believe that you can serve and want to serve, then sometimes it'll take a couple of goes, and sometimes you'll try different kind of spheres and places and things. But eventually, if you keep trying, you will get there, and we need you to get there.
Great, thank you for that. That is really inspiring. So I'm now going to ask Salma if she wants to say a few words.
Thanks, Josie. Hi, everybody. I'm Salma Arif, and I'm a Leeds City Councillor. I guess it's probably important for me to share a little bit about how I came into politics. I didn't find politics. I often say politics found me. I was at university when I joined the Labour Party, closely aligned to it. That's it. I wasn't involved in politics at all. I was what you'd call a card-carrying member. I didn't really want to get involved in local politics because the area that I come from, it was generally speaking male-dominated, and I didn't really want anything to do with that. However, that changed when we were selecting our next MP, who now is Richard Bergen. And I thought, well, I better turn up to this meeting because this person's going to represent me in Parliament. So it's really important that I go. So I vividly recall going into this building, walking into a fairly large room. And as I enter, there's 74 people in that room. Out of the 74 people, there were 3 women, and I was one of them. I think that perhaps, you know, often in life we have sort of moments or defining moments. I went home that night and I thought, goodness me, surely these are people that don't represent me and my community, because it was a room full of men. And I thought, well, actually, I'm part of the problem because I'm not getting involved. So what I did, I think a couple of days later, I made a phone call to the local branch and I said, I'd really like to get involved. I'm a Labour Party member. I've never attended any meetings, but I'd like to get involved. Surprisingly, they were really welcoming, and they were like, yeah, please do come along. I think they thought I would probably take notes and make teas for them. Obviously, I did no such thing. Very quickly, I got involved in sort of my local branch. I became the branch chair. I got involved in the CLP. And it was at that point people said to me, Salma, you're from Hare Hills, which is a very diverse area. You've lived here, you were born here, you get it, you understand the issues, you'd be a really good voice. Please consider standing. At that point, I was working as a consultant, and you know, I had doubts, as you do. Could I do this? Am I qualified? But then I always went back to that feeling of, you know, who is representing us, and I need to be there. So I got selected, and then I got elected a couple of years later with 79% of the vote, and since then I've been an elected councillor. That's sort of, in a nutshell, that's been my journey. There's something that I often say to people, is if you're not at the table, it's really important for us to be at the table, because if we're not at the table, we're going to be on the menu. Okay, so think about that. Yeah, so it's really important, if you want your voices heard and if you want as a community to be represented, which actually, Josie, you did give us some really awful stats there, but am I surprised? No, because the average age of a councillor is 60. More often than not, they will be called John or Robert. You know, there's not many Salmas out there. There's probably not a lot of Favours out there, but actually it's on us to be out there and create an atmosphere where we can encourage more women, put the ladder down. Unfortunately, there was really nobody there to put a ladder down for me, but I think what's important in my head is that the ladder's down there for people that they can climb up, and I put a hand out there. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation. Anybody out there who's thinking about standing, isn't quite sure, please consider it, because as I say, if you don't come to the table, then you'll end up being on the menu, and the likes of Johns and Roberts will decide what happens in our area. That's it for me.
Thank you, Selma. Sorry, it takes me a while to just unmute myself sometimes, but yeah, picking up what you said there, your last point about putting the ladder down, that is so important. And I think a lot of, you know, it can be very hard for new women to come through. You've got a lot of women that might have, you know, smashed the glass ceiling, but behind them, have they left the ladder down for people to come up from them? And I remember when I've been elected now for 10 years, and, you know, I think from the time I got elected, knowing how important it was for me that other women came behind me, I started putting down the ladder as soon as I got elected. You know, it's very pleasing now after 10 years, I can see so many other women come through. I was one of the first Black women to be elected in Barking, well, the first Black woman to be elected in Barking and Dagenham Council. And now we've got, you know, quite a lot. So, you know, encouraging other women to come behind us is key. So thanks for that, Salma. I'm going to ask Favour now to share her thoughts.
Thank you, Jessie. I didn't know I have broken glass ceiling, but it's good to hear. So I have a different kind of journey to politics. I actually migrated to UK in 2009 due to a personal circumstance. I chose to come through the highly skilled work permit, and I settled down briefly and ran into a Labour councillor, a lady in Harrow, and she was. We took the train from London. We were going to do time to change program somewhere in Telford, so it was a long journey, and we had a lot of discussions about politics and all that. So I had a bit of a personal challenge then, and she gave me very valuable advice on how to resolve that. So I was kind of curious because the lady, she's an Asian woman, quite young, not the typical impression I had about who could be a councillor. And so I came back and I registered with Labour Party. I went for my first CLP meeting in Hendon, where I lived in London then. And like Salma was saying, I entered the room. I was the only Black person there. Everyone there were white and middle class, and about that age range of late 50s to kind of 70s. So I recall entering the room and people were like, were you looking for someone, sort of? And but I sat down, listened to it, but I found it really hard and procedural. And I was trying to figure out in my mind what was going on. And so I continued, and then Ed Miliband came and became the leader of the Labour Party. And then they put out this advert for future candidates. So one of the people I usually meet, one of the ladies I usually meet in the meeting said, you could actually try, because there are very few Black people that go for these things. So I put in my application and I was successful. So that got me really interested about politics and standing. But before then, I have always been someone that felt that the society needed to be fairer and more equal. And so I became a school governor by default, by accident, because my daughter had a difficult experience in school. And so I became a school governor after moving to Watford in 2012. So from there, I joined the Labour Party in Watford again, and then began to campaign and became very active. So like Erica said, it's important that we talk about our challenges and our failures, because that's part of learning, and that's part of what helps us to get to the next stage. And so I stood for my first election in 2014. I lost that election, but I learned very valuable lessons. And one of the lessons I learned was that standing for election as a woman, as a Black woman, as a migrant, is sort of being minority within minority, sort of. So I needed to build network and support around myself to be able to get to the next level. And luckily for me, my local party was very supportive. I made more friends. And then I stood again in 2015, and I won the election. And I won the election as the first Black African woman in the council. But then again, 2016, because we had boundary changes, so we had another election, and I lost my seat by 25 votes. But before then, I became the vice chair of the CLP, and then later on, I stood again in 2019 and won the seat again. And then this year, I became the deputy group leader. One of the things I've learned in my journey is that politics is for everyone. There is tendency to think that it's for some people, it's not for some people. But everyone has something to share. We have a passion to bring to the table. So if you're listening to me this evening and you feel like me, and you look like me, and you sound like me, I would like you to consider standing for your community. It's so easy to think it's for them, it's not for me. It's for all of us, and all of us have something to bring to the table. I know it's challenging for women in different levels, but that is actually what we need to have a voice to speak about those challenges and to bring it to the table, so that people will hear the different views that reside in the community. We certainly need diversity among councillors. Only 4% of the councillors in England are from the Black community. Meanwhile, 97% of the Black community lives in England. You could compare the statistics and see the difference. It's huge. And so it is important that we hear those voices. And then if we come to table to bring those voices, then we shape the policies that affect women and families. And last night I moved a motion in our full council on the impact of COVID and on the BEM communities in Watford. And one of the things that came through was when I was scrutinizing the equality impact assessment. It turned out that the data that was used did not include anybody from the African Caribbean community. Zero number, completely. And if I wasn't in the council and I wasn't moving that motion, I wouldn't bring that up, that in 2020 going to 21, the data that we're using to do equality impact assessment in Watford has no figure for African Caribbean community. And as at 2011, we represent about 5.8% of the population in Watford. Yet, there was no figure for us. It was astounding for me. And that brought it, that was like the penny dropping for me, that if we are not there, nobody will speak for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Favour. That's a very powerful example of why women and women of colour need to be in the room when these important discussions are going ahead. If we're not there to scrutinise reports and things, then we're not part of those discussions. So that's a very you know, vivid example of why it's so important that we increase representation in our councils. And another thing you touched on was building a support network. That's I think key for women and women of colour in succeeding. So thank you for that. So lastly, I'm going to ask Ellie if she could now say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josie, and thank you to FWN for inviting me to be part of such an amazing panel. It's always hard going last, isn't it? Everyone said such fantastic things. And it's quite rare actually to get the chance to sort of reflect on this and look back a bit about, I guess, how I got involved, getting elected, and then I suppose the ways that I do the roles that I do now. So alongside my role on council, as Josie said, I'm also chair of the RNIB, which is a national charity. So I sort of split my life in half, which obviously, as you can imagine, some days works perfectly and other days is a disaster in terms of diary juggling. So I was elected in 2014 onto Brent Council. I spent my first year on scrutiny, and then I've been in cabinet ever since. But I wanted to go right back to the beginning, really, of getting involved in the Labour Party. So the other thing I should mention is that I'm blind, so I don't have any useful vision, and I never have had. So I rocked up to my local ward in about 2008, just moved into the area, and I thought, right, I am going to get involved locally. So I've been involved with the party at university and just kind of hadn't got round to it, you know, and getting properly involved. And the ward, unbeknown to me, was run by a very small group of older men, and they'd been running things for some time. And I accidentally upset things quite badly by, I think at my second meeting, volunteering to be ward secretary. I hadn't realised in my naivety that the long pause that was left after the chair asked for nominations was not intended to be filled. The idea was you leave the pause and then the current secretary was begged to do just another year. I didn't realise. So that was a slightly sort of naive, accidental start to things. I was also naive in taking on the role as secretary. So I found myself desperately trying to print out leaflets I couldn't see and deliver them to houses I could never find, certainly not without significant help. And it felt really important to succeed on the terms that had been kind of set out for me. You know, that was just how you did the job of ward secretary. So I sort of started out by really trying to sort of follow those rules. And I'll come back to that. I'd always been interested in local government. My first sort of grown-up job was with the New Local Government Network. So I'd always been interested in local government and what it did, and actually really taken by the closeness of local government to communities and to decisions that have a direct impact on people's lives. So I stood as part of Glenda Jackson's team in 2010 as a paper candidate. And then I stood in a by-election in an extremely cold February in 2011, and then finally got elected in 2014. And I have to say, one of the things I'm really lucky about is the ward I'm in. So they were and still are really fabulous. There are some amazing women in the ward. Our MP now, after Glenda retired, is Tulip Sadiq. So there's some great sort of female leadership locally. And they're fantastic. They pitch in, they, you know, they're willing to guide me when we go out canvassing. My co-councillors as well, both male, are also really good. And it's really recently come to the fore in terms of really valuing that local team that we've built, because, you know, obviously with social distancing rules and difficulties on public transport, getting out and about is actually quite challenging for me at the moment, because I rely on being guided physically, which is technically at the moment not allowed. So it's, you know, it's really interesting, and I'm having to rely on them in interesting and new ways. As I say, since I was elected, I've been on scrutiny and then held a couple of cabinet roles. The first one was environment, waste, parking and transport, and all of the really glamorous end of local government, and now housing and welfare reform. And there are aspects of both of those roles that were very male dominated, very frequently the only woman in the room. And people often said, oh, you must find that really hard, you know, being in the room with all those waste managers and you know, I have to say I found, and always have found, the political side of local government a lot tougher than the officer side in terms of diversity. So, you know, there's a real lack of sophistication in terms of gender diversity in politics. I have had one very public and embarrassing incident at full council where I was referred to as that woman. And the understanding and awareness of disability is incredibly basic. I haven't always found our party particularly friendly or a safe place on occasions in both aspects of that, but I'm sure some of you have those experiences, and that's doubly important why we keep going and improve things. I wonder sometimes if my role, having a leadership role, a sort of formal leadership role, protects me from some of it now, and particularly as the cabinet I serve on is 50-50 male and female, which of course is a huge testament to the women and men who've gone before me who have meant that that's the case. I think there are different standards applied to women though. I notice that I'm expected to be a lot more diligent perhaps than some of my male colleagues, and there are definitely sort of higher and different sorts of standards and expectations about how often we should speak and what sorts of things we should say. But circling back to what Josie said at the start, you know, those statistics are really depressing, and they're particularly depressing when you think about who local government has most impact on, who actually is mostly using public services, who does it really matter to that things work locally. And actually it's the very communities who are most poorly represented. So the things I've found to sort of help me keep going when things have got tough, and sometimes they really do, is that thing about finding your own way of doing the job. You know, I talked about, you know, sort of making myself deliver all those leaflets in the early days. I think if it was now, I probably wouldn't do that because I'm older and more confident, but it was definitely felt like a pressure at the time. And then the support of other women in Labour group and building those support teams, so locally with my co-councillors, but yeah, definitely in Labour group. I don't know that all of those women will ever vote for me in an internal election. In fact, I'm sure some of them won't. But I do know they'll always have my back if stuff kicks off in Labour group. So there's always a way of finding a way to do these roles in a way that suits you, in a way which really feels like yourselves. So I guess it's an encouragement to experiment and find a way that just feels right to you, because that's how you will be most successful.
Thank you, Ellie. That was again another powerful speech about, just, the different experiences that us women are having here at local government and what it takes to, survive and achieve. But it's very inspirational. So thank you for that. I mean, one of the things you touched on was the different standards that, are expected of men and women. I think we could all say that we've at some point in our political journeys have experienced that and wondered, actually, why is there a standard for me and a completely different standard for somebody else? I mean, and that's the way it's been for a very long time, and that needs to change. So what I'm going to ask, we've got quite a few participants on the call, so I'm going to open it up now for questions. So if you have a question that you would like to ask any of our 4 panelists or all of the panel, please get them in the Q&A so that we can ask them. But I'll kick it off with the first question. And this is really just to all of you, really. Given where we are now with the statistics at the moment, what do you think needs to happen to get us over the line, the 50-50 line? What do we need to do to, as a Labour Party, as a political system, the country, what do we need to do personally? What do you think we need to do as a party to increase the amount of women that are standing as councillors? I'm going to ask Erica to start.
Sure, happy to do that. So I'll give you kind of a range of answers. There's mostly American research, but some good research out there that says actually asking someone to run is a really powerful thing. I suspect that all of us were asked and actually most of us were probably asked repeatedly, because very few of us say yes the first time. It's that classic thing of a woman looks at a job description and says, oh, I can't do everything on it, I'm not applying. Our stereotypical man in this example looks at it and goes, oh yeah, I can do about half of it, I'd be great. So, you know, that encouragement to run and willingness to do it. And I don't know how much trouble this will get me in, but I'm going to say it anyway. So my academic research looks at young women's leadership in a global intergenerational women's organisation. And one of the things that came out of my research was that actually, if you're an older established woman in that organisation and you genuinely want to support young women's leadership, then maybe the most powerful thing you can do is actually decide that you're willing to step back and follow somebody else. So we'll only get to 50-50 women if some of the men who are currently councillors cease to be councillors. Now, that might be people retire, that might be that people lose selections, but whether you're a white woman like me, you know, there are times where it is not appropriate for me to be the spokesperson, where I should step back and make space for other people and lift other people up. If we want 50-50, then there are some men who are going to cease to be councillors. And, you know, women leaders of councils, there are, on a percentage basis, there are fewer women leaders of councils than there are women MPs. So we also need some men to decide that maybe they've been leader for long enough and they'll let somebody else have a go. But so run yourself, ask other people to run, encourage other women to run and support them when they do. And yeah, maybe look at making space for diversity. And that can be on all kinds of dimensions, but look at whether, in fact, your community would be better represented by someone else.
Thank you, Erica, for that. That to me makes sense. I actually heard that some while ago, and it was a man who said it. A man said, you know, if we are really serious about improving representation, that maybe some men need to step aside. And you know, also in terms of ethnic diversity, sometimes we need to think, you know, there's other ways that we can be really engaged politically and help the Labour Party other than standing for office. You know, there's loads of things that you could do, but maybe being in that elected position, maybe standing aside and letting somebody else run might be the best thing to do. What do you think, Salma?
Yeah, I agree with the points Erica's made. Absolutely. I think for me, we've got to remove some of the barriers that are currently there for younger women running or women with children running. There's a reason why John's at 60s are up there, because they're wealthy, you know, they've retired, they don't really have a lot of commitments. I personally had to leave my full-time job to do this full-time. I think we don't make it easy as a Labour group. We've got to, we've got to look again at making life easier. So if we're encouraging women from all walks of life to stand, then we've got to make it easy for them to stand, and we've got to remove barriers. And I think to some extent the pandemic has changed behaviours, and perhaps there's a lesson to learn. Councillors don't necessarily have to be at every meeting, that it can be done virtually, and I think we just need to look at the practicalities of removing those barriers and working on those barriers and having conversations in communities as to why aren't people coming forward. And a lot of the barriers I get is, well, it's just too time consuming, or, oh, that's just too much, I can't do it, I can't cope with a family and be a councillor. And therefore, what we're left with is the same sort of people, elected members in the community that are just not representative. So for me, the crucial thing is removing barriers, knowing what the barriers are in a community. Every community is different, recognising those barriers, supporting people to come forward and making it easier for them.
Great, thank you, Salma. That's. I mean, you touched on, you know, just making it more accessible, really, for people. You know, when you've always had a man who's in their 60s with very little commitments, then the council runs a certain way. you know, our council meetings used to go on till like midnight, you know, and when you've got people with young children, you know, just it's not going to work. So the council actually needs to change the way it does things if it wants to encourage other people from more diverse people, you know, that have jobs, or, you know, people from, you know, that have children to come in. So that's a really good point. I'm going to ask Favour if she's got any points on that.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I actually agree with Erica and Salma on the two issues of encouraging women to stand and also removing barriers. But I also want to speak a little bit about what we can do as Labour Party in terms of influencing policies. Some of the barriers that especially younger women face are issues to do with managing the family. In terms of childcare support and maternity leaves, not quite many councils have maternity leave policy as of now, and not all councils have childcare policies. So if you have children, maybe 3, 4 children, you need to go for committee meetings, council meetings, and how do you deal with all this without those level of support? And like Salma was saying, there's need for removing barriers for people that are still working age. Being a councillor shouldn't be the privilege of the retired middle-class white men, because we should reflect the community that we serve, and the community we serve have diverse range of people, including people that work, people that are not working, people with disabilities. We need to take steps to make sure that there's accessibility for every category of people that want to stand to be councillors. I'm kind of disappointed at the lack of support for people with disability to stand to be councillors. In terms of support for more Black women to stand to be councillors, we've been quite successful in Labour Party with all women shortlist. But I think we've got to a point now that we need to look at the possibility of all Black shortlist if we are going to get more Black people in, because different communities have different differential experiences, and it's important that we recognize that. And finally, we've spoken a lot about dropping down the ladder, and so we need to continue to work on mentoring. The Jokot Women in Leadership program was a fantastic program that I attended that changed my perspective about how I look at myself as a woman. Like Erica was saying, when you look at job description, you just say, oh, I'm not up to it. But a guy will look at it and say, okay, if I can meet half of it, then I'll go for it. And we're always apologetic, regardless of how successful we are. So that changed my, my perspective of how I see myself as a woman leader and as a feminist. And the Fabian Women Mentoring Program is also a very fantastic program that will encourage people, you know, to be part of, to nurture and build confidence. And the 50-50 Women Parliament is also another one. But the most important thing is to remove the barriers and to let people know that regardless of your background, there is something you bring because of that, your background. Not because outside of it, but because of that, your particular background, you bring something to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Favour. I mean, you've touched on, I guess, a sore point of mine, which is all Black shortlist. I think we know that the Labour Party are doing a lot better in, you know, getting more women elected as councillors and as MPs, and that's really one reason, and that's because of positive action. You know, we wouldn't have the representation and the Labour Party moving at the pace it's doing in terms of gender representation if it wasn't for all women shortlist, if it wasn't for the specification to make sure that at least one of the 3 councillors is a woman. We just wouldn't. So if you want to improve, you know, diversity in terms of, you know, increasing the number of people of colour in councils, then I think we're going to have to move down positive action route and all black shortlist. So I 100% agree with you on that point, Favour. Ellie, would you like to share?
Thanks very much. Just a couple of things, I guess, in addition to what the others have said, all of which are is great. I think I'm really struck by the comments about the kind of environments that are sometimes created in meetings and stuff. And I remember when I first joined the party, you know, I remember someone saying to me, you know, never ask a Labour member why they came to their first meeting. Always ask them why they came back a second time, because actually it can be really quite hard and unwelcoming. And actually, I think there's something really important there about the part that each of us plays in sort of creating the environment, and actually environments that don't feel kind of safe or you know, constructive, people don't speak out in them. And I think, you know, I've seen that happen, and that can feel really dangerous. And I think during COVID, it's been really interesting that I think some of the virtual group meetings we've had have actually been so much better, and people have spoken, people who I haven't heard of or from for 18 months, you know, suddenly you hear them speaking up, and the quality of debate, I think, has been much better. I also think in terms of the party, and I'll try and articulate this in a way which doesn't sound, which I hope makes sense, but I think we struggle a bit, particularly in terms of disability. So we are very, very strong on our words around equity, inclusion, diversity, and social justice and everything. And I think sometimes because we hold those values and principles so dear, it makes it really hard for us to have an honest kind of look at ourselves and question, is that actually how it feels on the ground? And I think there certainly does feel sometimes a huge gap between what we say and how that feels. And so I think that there's a real encouragement to the party, I think, to start looking more at disability and experiences of poverty and homelessness, you know, in a different way, which I guess, you know, doesn't sort of define people by them. You know, still in the party, we talk about the poor, the vulnerable. I don't know who these people are. I've never knocked on a door and someone said, oh, the thing is about me is that I'm poor or I'm, you know, on the whole, people don't. They talk about what their experiences are and how those experiences make them feel. And I think that sort of language, which feels very othering, it stops, it puts up a barrier to people with disabilities or people who are experiencing poverty or homelessness being taken seriously, and an assumption that politics is somehow about us, not for us.
Thank you, Ellie. That's a really important point, actually. And I often hear the area that I live in called deprived. And it's interesting, the people that refer to it as deprived don't live here, because nobody that lives here calls the area deprived. Only the outsiders call this area deprived. And it's actually quite, you know, it is about the language of othering, and we set ourselves as the other when we talk about people who are disadvantaged. But thanks for those responses. I've got a really interesting question here, and it's what strategies can we use to regain former Labour-controlled councils? So, Erica, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, but some of them I'm probably not going to share on something that's going to be broadcast in the nicest possible way. I think there is actually a really interesting conversation to have here, in that there's an absolute lack of women councillors and women MPs, although we're doing better there. But actually, the other thing our party really lacks is women strategists. So how often do you meet a woman campaign manager? Women organisers are more common. Woman regional director. Don't know how many of you know Nan Sloan from the Labour Women's Network, who's a former regional director, and of course in the Northwest we have great woman regional director. But actually, that if you sit in a room and say, actually, I'm going to run this campaign, I'm going to plan it, I'm going to lead it, I'm going to run it, it's very unlikely that that's a woman. So that's another whole bit of work for us to do. I and one of my friends who sometimes works as a party organiser, we have an ongoing discussion about how somebody, whether that's one of the many women's networks of the party, somebody needs to run strategist training, because actually there is a gender gap in voting. There are different issues, there are different strategies to mobilise different communities, and we will always do a better job campaigning if we are more diverse and more representative of the community we're trying to speak to. And part of that is, bringing women's experience to that planning table when you decide which issues are most important, because campaigns that women run, classically, we run about, street lighting is really important to us, because we know how scary it is to walk down a dark street, because we're the people who kind of worry whether there's somebody following us, and we know where in our neighbourhood actually it feels like the streetlights don't quite cut it, because there are patches that we don't walk through, and so I think part of what we need to do is actually build our ground game and include more women in that as organisers. And I am from an organising tradition, so I very much believe in the community organising approach to that. And that's what councillors kind of do innately. We talk to our residents, we knock on doors, we have coffee with them, we see them at shops, and we pick up on what are local issues that are important, and then we work to build a campaign and we work to find a solution. And actually, for lots and lots of women, that's how they come into politics, because they were worried about the safety of their child walking to school. They were worried about, as I said, street lighting. They were worried about all sorts of things, but that's often how women come in. And actually that's how we win back councils, is by demonstrating that we care about the issues that people are concerned about in their communities, because this is local politics, but also by building really strong campaigns. I'm always very fond of telling people that campaigning is in fact a team sport. It's not just about a candidate, and James Groves, who's our CLP secretary, will always tell you that a candidate is a legal necessity, but not a lot more. Your campaign is won by the team you build. And so building teams that include good numbers of women and giving women opportunity to demonstrate and develop their skills as strategists and campaign managers is a really important part of how we build a stronger campaigning party. Josie, you've gone on excursion. I'm guessing that...
Hiya, sorry about that. Great. Salma, what would your thoughts on that?
Erica, actually, you've picked on something that I've not thought about. Women strategists, absolutely lacking in that. And actually, she's got a really good point about, when you think of who's running a campaign, it's often more often than not, it is a male. So that's something that we should look at. I think for me, the key thing is we need to lay the blame where it belongs. 10 years of Tory austerity has led those that were Labour councillors on their knees, and we're the real enemy, I think, and that's the message we need to get to the public out there. And I think there's something important about having candidates who know their communities and can have those conversations. So being careful of, it's often when somebody's knocking on your door. I remember before I was a councillor, I'd question who was knocking on my door. Do you live here? Do you belong here? Where have you come from? And if there was somebody from outside, I just couldn't communicate with them because they didn't get the issues. So I think another strategy is just being careful about the people that are candidates. And again, I know that people said to me, stand, because they felt that I could represent them. So I think that's a strategy we need to employ in terms of being careful about the candidates that we choose, and candidates who understand their communities, who can knock on the door, know Mr. Jones or Mrs. Whoever, and have those conversations and being able to relate. But the key thing is, and the Tories are very good at this, the blame needs to go to them, and they are ultimately responsible for the issues we are having in the local community, because they are not giving us the funding we need to operate our councils.
Thank you. Favour, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I totally agree with Eric and Thelma in terms of building more capacity in terms of women being strategists and organizing at grassroots level. But there's something else I wanted to talk about. And I think for us to win more votes and take control of the councils, starts within our CLPs and our party in general. And I think I agree with what Don Butler said, that a divided party do not win election. And so we need to unify. We need to, as much as possible, build together rather than being divided in lines of parties and everyone on their own faction. We need to come together because we are Labour Party and we can never win election when we are divided because the community sees it, the community can read it when we are speaking different voices to the community. So we need to come together and speak with one voice. The other thing I've actually thought about for a while is that we need as a party to define who we are speaking to. There's this book I read in the JOCOS program. They asked us to read some books and review. So one of the ones I read and reviewed is The New Working Class. So that book actually takes time to explore who is the new working class. Because we keep saying Labour is a party for the working class, for the marginalized, for this and for that. But we need to define again who this working class is. And the 21st century has actually redefined the new working class for us. So we need to be very clear about who our core message is for. And also, I think we need to be very clear how we communicate our visions. Sometimes we have very good policies, very good plans, but we're not really communicating them properly in the way that is understood by the different groups of people that we're speaking to. And finally, I think as those of us that are already in the council, we need to build strong Labour groups in the council. We're in a position in Watford. Watford is a Lib Dem controlled council and Labour is in opposition. And so that presents a different challenge. So Watford Watford MP is a Tory, then the council itself is a Lib Dem council. And then Labour is in opposition and there's no single Tory councillor in Watford. So the dynamics in Watford is unbelievable. But that challenge actually presents an opportunity for us. The opportunity to build strong Labour group that are united to support the communities in the way that deliver the vision of Labour Party. And by doing that, we should be able to increase our numbers and eventually take hold of the council. Thank you.
Thank you, Favour. So Ellie, what are your thoughts on how we can win back former Labour councils?
Yeah, well, I guess to add to what others have said, there's something about that tradition of quite transactional politics which feels kind of out of date now. So I think particularly in London where people move around a lot, you don't have that kind of natural affinity to an area often. I think that can be quite challenging. But I think sometimes it feels like we're afraid to really talk about what the issues fundamentally are. And I think we are moving towards a much more, kind of issue-based politics, I suppose. So I think we need to not take groups of voters for granted, but really revisit some of those key issues. I think the point about, new working class is a really interesting one as well. And that actually, categorizing people in any ways is always a dangerous business. And clearly there are some ways in which it's quite helpful when you are actually on the campaign trail. But outside of the mechanisms and the mechanistic parts of campaigning, I think people sometimes are not as confident as they could be at just addressing issues and finding legitimacy in ways of bringing people together, which might not be explicitly about asking for votes. And you know, be interesting post-COVID to see what happens to door knocking, because, you know, I think that's a really tricky area. And I've noticed more and more people just don't answer. And I think lots of us probably wouldn't answer at 8 o'clock at night if someone knocked on the door. So things are changing, and we need to be really ahead of that in bringing people together to talk about issues, to demonstrate how we're, it's a horrible phrase and I don't quite mean sort of adding value, but what change we're going to make, you know, what's going to be different. People, I think it's patronizing to assume that people kind of won't get it or can't sort of come on that journey with you. So I think issues based is absolutely crucial, and legitimizing you know, those groups that come together talking about issues, that's as much politics as going out delivering 150 leaflets is.
Thank you, Ellie, for that. That's so that brings actually the event to a close. You know, we've really, I've found, you know, some of the stories that you've all shared and your experiences, how you've moved forward, just so inspiring. And I've been reading the comments on the chat. I can see that people have been really encouraged by what they've heard, and you know, it's actually been quite a thought-provoking discussion that we've had this evening. And I hope that people in the Labour Party head office has been listening in to some ideas of how we can actually win back Labour, former Labour councils going forward. So that brings us to an end. I would like to say a big thank you to all our panelists here. You've been fantastic, you know. So that brings us to an end. Good night and good evening.
Thank you very much.
Bye.